The morning of February 28, 2026, began like any other across the Middle East. In Tehran, the call to prayer echoed through quiet streets as the city slowly stirred to life. Shopkeepers prepared for the day. Families gathered for their morning meals. This fragile peace was shattered in an instant. The day would not end as it began. It would end with the sky on fire, the ground trembling, a nation reeling from a sudden, devastating blow. This was the dawn of the 2026 Iran War. The attack was a meticulously coordinated and shocking display of military power. It was initiated by the United States and its key regional ally, Israel. At 2038 UTC, U.S. President Donald Trump gave the final order, Operation Epic Fury. Hours later, at 0635 UTC, CENTCOM announced coordinated airstrikes within Iran. This was not a limited engagement. It was the opening salvo of a full-scale war designed to cripple Iran's leadership and military capability. The world watched in stunned silence. 10 minutes after the American announcement, the strategic purpose became clear. At 0645 UTC, the Israeli Air Force launched unprecedented decapitation strikes. They were not aimed at bases or infrastructure alone. Their targets, the highest echelons of the Iranian state. Within minutes, strikes hit their marks, killing Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Several other high-ranking government and military officials were also killed. The news sent shockwaves across Iran and the globe, leaving a power vacuum at the regime's core. The immediate aftermath: chaos, disbelief, profound shock. For the people of Iran, the sudden death of a long-time leader was seismic, coupled with the terrifying reality of a foreign attack on their homeland. The element of surprise was total. There had been no formal declaration of war, no ultimatum, just the sudden roar of jets and the impact of explosions. This was a direct nation-to-nation conflict, the United States and Israel versus the Islamic Republic of Iran. The stakes were clear, not a proxy battle or a skirmish, but a war for survival and dominance in the Middle East. The global reaction to the surprise attack was swift and fractured, reflecting deep geopolitical divides. Financial markets reacted with immediate panic, frantic trading floors and tumbling tickers. Oil markets spiking as the Strait of Hormuz closed. Oil prices soared to levels not seen in years, sending a jolt of economic fear. Airlines scrambled, reroutes and cancellations. Airports emptied, travelers stranded. The United Nations called emergency sessions, diplomats racing to assess and contain the situation. On the ground, fear was immediate and visceral. In Iran, shock turned to grief, anger, and uncertainty. Sirens and smoke plumes filled targeted streets. In Israel and Gulf states, citizens watched with trepidation. The attack had unleashed forces no one fully controlled. The human cost began mounting. Initial casualty reports painted a grim picture. At least 1,937 people had been killed inside Iran. At least 19 killed in Israel from retaliatory strikes. 13 U.S. soldiers lost in initial engagements. 25 people killed in attacks on neighboring Gulf states. These numbers, however, were just the beginning. Humanitarian organizations and news agencies struggled to keep up. Politically, the stakes were enormous. The decapitation of Iran's leadership was a high-risk gamble. It could provoke prolonged resistance or force a quick end. Would Operation Epic Fury ignite a wider war? The future of the Middle East hung in the balance. Table of Contents. Part 2, Act 1. Timeline and Key Events. 1. February 28th. Operation Epic Fury unleashed. 2. March 1st through 3rd. The initial response and escalation. 3. March 4th through 7th. A region on high alert. 4. March 8th. A new supreme leader ascends. 5. Early March. The lines of conflict solidify. The first day, February 28, 2026, stunned the world with speed and precision. It began under the cover of darkness, a calculated move for surprise. The order came from U.S. President Donald Trump at 20 hours and 38 minutes UTC the previous day. That order set in motion a chain of events across CENTCOM and partner forces. They finalized preparations for a massive pre-dawn wave of strikes. The night looked quiet, but an immense force was ready to be unleashed. 6 hours and 35 minutes UTC, the silence shattered. CENTCOM issued a terse announcement. Airstrikes against Iran had begun. This was the public's first official confirmation. The strikes were broad and systematic, hitting multiple targets: key military infrastructure, command and control centers, air defense systems, suspected nuclear facilities across the country. The goal? Degrade Iran's ability to fight from the first hour. Civilians woke to explosions and anti-aircraft fire across cities. 10 minutes after the U.S. announcement, at 6:45 UTC, Phase 2 began. The Israeli Air Force launched highly targeted decapitation strikes. The primary target, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. The strikes succeeded. Khamenei was killed. Several senior officials in his inner circle were also killed. The immediate effect: shock and confusion at the top of Iran's leadership. State media confirmed the deaths. Rumors became grim certainty. Surviving officials scrambled to form a chain of command amid ongoing bombardment. The U.S.-Israeli strategy had sown chaos, but also planted a burning desire for revenge. In the immediate days following the initial assault, Iran's military apparatus, though damaged, began to orchestrate its response. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, despite the loss of key commanders, initiated a series of retaliatory missile strikes. On March 1st, rockets were launched towards known U.S. military installations in Iraq, the Gulf states, and targets inside Israel. These counterattacks were less technologically sophisticated, but demonstrated Iran's unwavering resolve to fight back. The message was clear: the attack on its leadership and sovereignty would not go unanswered. The skies over the Middle East became a contested battle space, sirens wailing in cities from Tel Aviv to Dubai. The United States and its allies were prepared and responded with a second wave of intense military action. CENTCOM announced a no-fly zone over western Iran and began targeting IRGC missile launch sites and naval assets in the Persian Gulf. The conflict escalated from a surprise attack into a sustained multi-front military engagement. U.S. naval fleets, including the USS Tripoli Carrier Strike Group, enforced a blockade on Iranian ports. The initial shock of the war morphed into the grim reality of a protracted bloody fight, with both sides trading heavy blows and absorbing significant losses. The human cost mounted alarmingly during the first 72 hours. In Iran, emergency services were overwhelmed as they tried to reach victims of the continuing airstrikes, which now hit industrial and military sites, some near populated areas. Hospitals struggled with an influx of casualties. Simultaneously, Iranian strikes hit civilians in Israel and the Gulf states, causing deaths and widespread panic. The initial casualty figure of 1,937 dead in Iran, reported by Al Jazeera, proved conservative as humanitarian organizations documented the dead. By March 3rd, the conflict began to expand regionally. Iran's proxy network and allies were activated. In Lebanon, Hezbollah exchanged fire with Israeli forces on the northern border, shattering a fragile truce and opening a new front. In Yemen, the Houthi rebels entered the war, firing ballistic missiles towards Israel and threatening Red Sea shipping. The U.S.-Iran standoff was no longer bilateral. It was metastasizing into a regional war with multiple flashpoints. Section 3. March 4-7. A region on high alert. As the first week of March unfolded, disruption intensified dramatically. The Strait of Hormuz, vital for global oil transport, was effectively shut down. Iran mined the strait, and Iran's navy menaced vessels attempting passage. The act sent shockwaves through the global economy. Oil prices spiked. Shipping companies were forced into costly reroutes around Africa. The war's impact reached far beyond the battlefield. Consumers felt the pain worldwide. Nations dependent on Middle Eastern energy faced economic threats. Civilian life across the region was thrown into chaos. Iranian cities faced rolling blackouts and rationing of essentials. Airstrikes targeted energy infrastructure and supply lines. Millions were forced to seek shelter. Many fled cities for the countryside, creating a growing internal refugee crisis. The skies over the Middle East were largely empty of commercial aircraft. Flights came to a near-total standstill, stranding tourists, expatriates, and business travelers. Humanitarian and supply corridors were cut off. The war created an invisible siege around the region. The conflict entered a grinding, attritional phase. U.S. and Israeli forces continued their air campaign. They shifted focus to dismantle Iran's industrial base and nuclear sites. Israel reported early successes on March 6, claiming strikes deep inside Iran, including sensitive nuclear and industrial facilities near Isfahan. Iran vowed a heavy price, accusing its adversaries of playing with fire by targeting civilian infrastructure. Rhetoric grew heated as each strike fueled retaliation. On the region's periphery, the ground situation deteriorated. In southern Lebanon, skirmishes escalated into larger clashes between Israel and Hezbollah. Israeli troops pushed across the border to create a security zone. Clashes were reported near Qiyam and near Tyre, as Israel advanced toward the Litani River. The fronts multiplied, raising the risk of catastrophic escalation that could engulf previously sidelined nations. Section 4. March 8. A new supreme leader ascends. Amidst the chaos of the ongoing war, a pivotal political development took place in Tehran on March 8, 2026. After 10 days of intense, secretive deliberations following the death of his father, Mojtaba Khamenei was elected as the new supreme leader of Iran. The Assembly of Experts, the clerical body responsible for appointing the leader, convened under immense pressure to ensure continuity of governance and project an image of stability. The choice of Mojtaba, a mid-ranking cleric but also the son of the slain leader, was seen by many as a move to consolidate power within a trusted circle and rally the nation around a familiar name during a moment of existential crisis. The ascension of Mojtaba Khamenei was a deeply significant moment, both symbolically and strategically. It signaled that the core of the Iranian regime, while battered, was not broken. The succession process, though accelerated by war, followed constitutional procedure, lending it an air of legitimacy that was crucial for maintaining domestic control. For the Iranian people and its military, the appointment of a new leader provided a focal point for national unity and resistance. The state-controlled media broadcasted images of the new supreme leader praying and meeting with military commanders, carefully crafting a narrative of resilience and unwavering resolve in the face of foreign aggression. Internationally, the reaction to Mojtaba's appointment was mixed. For the United States and for Israel, the rapid succession was a partial setback to their strategy. The goal of the decapitation strike was to induce a prolonged power struggle and systemic collapse. But the swift appointment of a successor suggested the Iranian system was more resilient than anticipated. Analysts in Western capitals immediately began scrutinizing Mojtaba's past statements and clerical history, trying to predict whether his leadership would be more pragmatic or even more hardline than his father's. His first public statements would be watched with intense interest for any clues about Iran's future strategy in the war. Mojtaba Khamenei's first address to the nation was defiant. He eulogized his father as a martyr and vowed to exact severe revenge for his death in the attack on Iran. He condemned the U.S. and Israel as great Satans and called for total national mobilization to defend the homeland. There was no hint of compromise or de-escalation in his words. Instead, he sought to frame the conflict as a holy defense of the nation and the Islamic Revolution itself. His rise to power solidified the Iranian position, dashing any immediate hopes for a collapse from within, and setting the stage for a longer, more ideologically charged conflict. The war now had a new leader to rally behind. Section 5, early March. The lines of conflict solidify. By the second week of March, the initial shock had subsided, replaced by the grim reality of a violent new status quo. The lines had been drawn on the battlefield and in the diplomatic arena. The United States delivered a 15-point plan to Tehran through intermediaries. The proposal demanded the complete dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program. It demanded an end to Iran's support for proxy groups. It demanded limitations on Iran's ballistic missile capabilities. In exchange, the U.S. offered a cessation of hostilities, a victor's peace. Iran was far from defeated. Iran's rejection was swift and unequivocal. Press TV quoted an anonymous official. Iran had rejected the ceasefire plan. Iran will end the war when it decides to do so, and when its own conditions are met. Tehran still believed it could shape the outcome, despite heavy losses. The regime refused to negotiate from perceived weakness, with leadership's blood still fresh. Iran issued its own counterproposal on state television. The Iranian plan mirrored American demands, grievance, and a bid to reset regional power. It called for an immediate halt to targeted killings of its officials. It demanded international guarantees against future wars. It demanded full reparations for the damage inflicted. It demanded recognition of absolute sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. The diplomatic impasse ensured the conflict would continue, both sides entrenched. By mid-March, casualties continued to climb. Harana reported over 3,100 killed in Iran, including more than 2,300 civilians. The Israeli military estimated between 3,000 and 4,000 Iranian forces eliminated, soldiers, commanders. These stark numbers, combined with unyielding diplomatic stances, painted a bleak picture. The initial phase was over. A brutal, grinding conflict replaced it. The stage was set for a long and devastating war. The true cost of the 2026 Iran war is most starkly measured in human lives. In the initial weeks of the conflict, casualty figures emerged as a grim, contested battleground of their own. Early reports from sources like Al Jazeera provided a preliminary glimpse, tallying 1,937 dead in Iran, alongside dozens of casualties among U.S. forces in Israel and in neighboring Gulf states. However, these numbers were just the opening chapter of a rapidly unfolding tragedy. As the fighting intensified and spread, the initial counts were quickly eclipsed by far more devastating statistics, revealing the sheer scale of the violence being unleashed upon the region and its people. The numbers represented families torn apart, futures erased, and communities shattered by the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare. As humanitarian organizations gained limited access and began their painstaking work, a more detailed and harrowing picture began to form. By March 17th, the non-governmental organization Human Rights Activists News Agency, or Harana, had documented 3,114 deaths inside Iran alone resulting directly from the airstrikes. 1,354 civilians, 1,138 military personnel, 622 individuals remained unclassified amid the chaos. This breakdown highlighted the devastating impact on non-combatants who found themselves caught in the crossfire of a war waged from the skies, with bombs falling on military targets often located perilously close to residential neighborhoods. The belligerents in the conflict offered their own perspectives on the death toll, often framed to support their military objectives and narratives. The Israeli military, for instance, released its own estimates around March 13th, focusing specifically on the damage inflicted upon Iran's armed forces. They claimed that their operations had successfully killed between 3,000 and 4,000 Iranian soldiers and commanders. This figure, substantially higher than others, was presented as evidence of the effectiveness of their campaign to degrade Iran's military capabilities. However, such numbers, whether from military sources or NGOs, were impossible to independently verify, existing as part of the information war that ran parallel to the physical one. This divergence in casualty figures underscores the profound difficulty of counting the dead in the midst of a war. Each number, whether from an official government source, a news agency, or a human rights group, told a different part of the story. Official figures from Iran were often slow to be released and focused on civilian martyrdom, while US and Israeli reports emphasized enemy combatant losses. The reality for those on the ground was a constant state of uncertainty and fear, where the loss of life was both a statistical reality reported on the news and a deeply personal tragedy felt in homes and communities across the country. The grim tally was rising daily, with no end in sight. For the millions of civilians living in Iranian cities, daily life transformed into a harrowing struggle for survival. The rhythm of urban existence was replaced by the terrifying cadence of air raid sirens and the percussive thunder of distant and not-so-distant explosions. Simple routines became life-threatening risks. A trip to the marketplace for bread could be interrupted by the sudden roar of fighter jets overhead, sending shoppers scrambling for cover. Schools were closed indefinitely, their empty playgrounds a silent testament to a stolen generation of childhoods. Parents faced the impossible choice, whether to keep their families huddled in basements or risk venturing out for essential supplies, weighing the threat of bombs against the certainty of hunger. The war's impact was etched onto the very fabric of cities like Tehran, Isfahan, and Shiraz. Residential buildings near strategic targets were often damaged or destroyed by the concussive force of airstrikes. Photos showed apartment blocks with their facades sheared off, revealing lives abruptly interrupted, a child's bedroom exposed to the sky, a dining table covered in dust and debris. The destruction of critical infrastructure, power plants, water treatment facilities, plunged entire neighborhoods into darkness and left taps running dry, compounding the misery and creating a public health crisis. Hospitals and clinics became epicenters of the human cost, operating on the front lines of a war, creating casualties faster than they could be treated. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock, performing surgeries by flashlight and rationing dwindling supplies of anesthesia and antibiotics. The corridors were filled with the wounded, their injuries telling the story of the war: severe burns, shrapnel wounds, crush injuries from collapsed buildings. The constant influx of civilian casualties, including a heartbreaking number of children, placed an unimaginable emotional and physical strain on medical staff, who were themselves grieving colleagues and family members lost to the violence. Beyond the immediate physical danger, the psychological toll on the urban population was immense and immeasurable. The constant state of high alert, the lack of sleep, and the perpetual fear for one's safety and the safety of loved ones created a collective trauma. The sound of a car backfiring could trigger panic, and the sight of a plane in the sky was no longer a mundane observation, but a potential harbinger of death. This pervasive anxiety seeped into every aspect of life, fraying social bonds and leaving deep, invisible scars on the psyche of a nation under siege. For those in the cities, the war was not a distant event on a map, but an intimate, terrifying, and ever-present reality. The relentless aerial bombardment of Iranian cities triggered a massive and desperate movement of people. Fearing for their lives, hundreds of thousands of families made the agonizing decision to abandon their homes, packing what few belongings they could carry into cars, buses, and carts. This created a vast wave of internally displaced persons, a river of humanity flowing out of major urban centers towards the relative safety of rural villages and remote provinces. The roads leading out of cities like Tehran and Tabriz became choked with traffic, a slow-moving exodus of people whose lives had been upended in a matter of days. They were not leaving in search of a better life, but simply in search of life itself. This internal displacement placed an enormous strain on the host communities. Small towns and villages, already struggling with their own shortages due to the war, saw their populations double or even triple overnight. Resources like food, water, and shelter, which were scarce to begin with, were stretched to the breaking point. Makeshift camps sprang up in open fields, schools, and mosques, with displaced families huddling together against the cold, sharing what little they had. For those with the means or the desperation, the journey did not end within Iran's borders. A secondary wave of refugees began to spill across the frontiers into neighboring countries like Turkey, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. These borders, already complex and often militarized, became sites of human desperation. Families undertook perilous journeys through mountainous terrain and across arid deserts, risking exploitation by smugglers and capture by border patrols. The arrival of thousands of Iranian refugees presented an immediate humanitarian and political crisis for neighboring governments, who were ill-equipped to handle such a large influx and feared being drawn further into the regional conflagration that was driving people from their homes. The stories that emerged from these refugee routes were filled with heartbreak and resilience. Personal vignettes painted a vivid picture of the human cost. One family described walking for 3 days with their elderly grandmother after their car ran out of fuel, surviving on scraps of bread and the kindness of strangers. A young university student spoke of leaving his entire family behind, clutching only his degree certificate as proof of a future that now seemed impossible. These were not just statistics in a report, they were individual lives, each one a universe of loss, a testament to the devastating power of war to unmake worlds and scatter their inhabitants to the winds. Section 4. A generation scarred. Among the most tragic casualties of the 2026 Iran war are the children, an entire generation whose lives are being irrevocably shaped by violence, loss, and fear. With schools closed across the country, the fundamental structures of childhood have disintegrated. Education has been replaced by a curriculum of survival. Instead of learning math or history, children are learning to distinguish the sound of an incoming missile from the rumble of a passing truck. Playgrounds have fallen silent. Playing with friends, kicking a ball in the street, feeling safe in one's own home have been stolen by the ever-present threat of attack from the sky. The physical and psychological trauma inflicted upon these young minds will have consequences that last for decades. Humanitarian organizations on the ground have reported a sharp increase in children presenting with symptoms of severe psychological distress, constant nightmares, bedwetting, aggressive behavior, or a withdrawn silence from which they cannot be coaxed. Many have witnessed horrific events, including the death or injury of family members or the destruction of their homes. These experiences leave deep, invisible wounds that, without proper long-term care, can manifest as lifelong mental health challenges, perpetuating a cycle of trauma for generations to come. The war has also created a new and vulnerable population of orphans. With thousands of civilians and soldiers killed, countless children have been left without one or both parents. In a society where the extended family is a crucial support network, the chaos of war and displacement often separates children from their relatives, leaving them alone and unprotected. These children are at extreme risk of exploitation, trafficking, and recruitment by armed groups. Their plight represents a profound moral failure of the conflict, a stark reminder that the consequences of war are always paid most heavily by the most innocent and defenseless members of society. The loss of education represents another deep scar on this generation. The closure of schools and universities is not just a temporary disruption. It is the erasure of a future. For every month the conflict continues, millions of students fall further behind, and the knowledge gap widens. This creates the prospect of a lost generation of Iranians who will lack the skills and education needed to rebuild their country once the fighting stops. The war is not only destroying the physical infrastructure of Iran, but also its human capital, crippling the potential of the very people who will be tasked with healing the nation's wounds and charting its path forward in a post-war world. Section 5. The Fog of War. Reporting on the true human cost of the 2026 Iran war is an incredibly difficult and dangerous task, shrouded in what military strategists call the fog of war. Access for independent international journalists and human rights monitors is severely restricted. Both sides have an interest in controlling the narrative, which means limiting what information gets out and what journalists can see. Reporters who do manage to operate within the conflict zone face immense risks, being targeted in airstrikes, detained by security forces, or caught in the crossfire. This makes verifying casualty figures and documenting human rights abuses an almost impossible challenge. The information that does emerge is often fragmented, contradictory, and heavily influenced by propaganda. State-controlled media in Iran focuses on civilian suffering and martyrdom, presenting a narrative of national victimhood and heroic resistance. Conversely, military press briefings from the US and Israel tend to emphasize the precision of their strikes and focus on enemy combatant casualties, downplaying or omitting civilian deaths, often dismissed as collateral damage. Social media becomes a battleground of its own, flooded with genuine eyewitness accounts, misinformation, and deliberately fabricated content designed to sow confusion and sway public opinion. This lack of clear, verifiable information creates a profound uncertainty that is itself a form of human cost. For families with loved ones in the conflict zones, or for those whose relatives have gone missing, the absence of reliable news is a form of torture. They are left to sift through conflicting reports and graphic, unverified images online, hoping for any sign that their family members are safe. The difficulty in confirming deaths means that many families are unable to properly grieve, caught in a painful limbo of not knowing whether their loved ones are alive or dead. This uncertainty paralyzes communities and hinders the work of humanitarian aid organizations trying to reunite families. Ultimately, the first draft of the war's history is being written in real time, but it is an incomplete and heavily biased account. The full, true human cost may not be known for years, until after the guns have fallen silent, and impartial investigators can finally access the sites of attacks, interview survivors, and painstakingly piece together the evidence. Until then, the world receives only glimpses of the tragedy through the fog. The stark numbers from NGOs, the heart-wrenching personal vignettes, the contested claims of the belligerents. What is certain is that every reported number represents a human being, and the true toll is undoubtedly far higher than any official count can capture. Section 1. The Diplomatic Deadlock. As the initial shock of the war gave way to a grinding conflict, the first tentative steps towards a diplomatic resolution began, only to immediately founder on the rocks of irreconcilable demands. The United States, through Swiss and Omani intermediaries, presented Iran with a comprehensive 15-point plan designed to end the hostilities. This proposal was less a negotiation and more a list of terms for surrender. It demanded the complete and verifiable dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program, severe limitations on its ballistic missile development, and a total cessation of its support for allied militant groups across the Middle East. Iran's response to the American ultimatum was one of swift and contemptuous rejection. The proposal was seen in Tehran not as a genuine peace offer, but as an attempt to achieve through diplomacy what had not yet been fully won on the battlefield. Iran's English-language broadcaster, Press TV, quoted an unnamed senior official who articulated the regime's defiant stance. The official stated that Iran would not be dictated to and would end the war only on its own terms and at a time of its choosing. In a bold countermove, Iran broadcast its own peace plan directly to the world via state television, flipping the script on its adversaries. The Iranian proposal was built on a foundation of national sovereignty and grievance. It demanded an immediate and permanent halt to the targeted assassination of its leaders and officials, backed by robust international guarantees against future aggression. Furthermore, Tehran insisted on full financial reparations for the immense damage inflicted upon its infrastructure and economy. This diplomatic exchange revealed a chasm too wide to bridge. The The two plans were fundamentally incompatible, each demanding the other side's strategic capitulation. The U.S. sought to disarm Iran and dismantle its regional influence, while Iran sought to secure its regime, receive compensation, and solidify its authority. The most contentious point in Iran's plan was its demand for recognized sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, a non-starter for the United States and the global community. With no common ground and no appetite for compromise, the diplomatic track reached a complete deadlock. The failure of talks ensured that the war's resolution would be sought not at the negotiating table, but through continued bloodshed on the battlefield. The U.S.-Iran war inevitably spilled across borders, and its most violent regional manifestation erupted on Israel's northern frontier with Lebanon. Iran's closest and most formidable ally, Hezbollah, immediately entered the fray. What began as sporadic cross-border rocket fire on February 29th quickly escalated into a full-blown second front. Hezbollah, possessing a vast arsenal of rockets and battle-hardened fighters, saw the attack on its patron as an existential threat to its own position. The group began launching coordinated attacks on Israeli military positions and northern communities, forcing widespread evacuations and stretching the Israeli military, which was already engaged in a major air campaign against Iran. The fragile quiet that had largely held since the 2006 war was shattered completely. Israel responded to Hezbollah's aggression with overwhelming force, launching intense airstrikes against positions in southern Lebanon and against strongholds in the suburbs of Beirut. The Israeli War Cabinet determined that air power alone would not be sufficient. This led to a difficult and dangerous decision, a ground incursion. Israeli troops and armor crossed the border with the stated objective of creating a deep security zone to push Hezbollah fighters and their rocket launchers away from the border. This move marked a significant escalation, turning proxy skirmishes into a direct ground war and raising the specter of a full-scale Israeli reoccupation of southern Lebanon. The fighting on the ground was fierce and bloody. Israeli troops pushed towards the Litani River, a strategic line with historical significance for Israeli ambitions in Lebanon. They encountered stiff resistance from entrenched Hezbollah fighters who used intimate knowledge of the terrain to mount ambushes and counterattacks. Heavy clashes were reported around Qiyam and near Tyre. For civilians of southern Lebanon, the war was a terrifying repeat of past conflicts. Entire villages were emptied as families fled the fighting, creating another wave of displacement in a region already saturated with human suffering. This northern front became a critical component of Iran's broader war strategy. By activating Hezbollah, Iran forced Israel to fight a two-front war, diverting military resources and attention away from the primary campaign against Iran. It was a classic example of Iran's doctrine of asymmetrical warfare, using its proxy network to bleed a technologically superior adversary and raise the costs of the conflict. The escalation in Lebanon showed the war could not be contained within Iran's borders. It became a regional conflagration, and the people of Lebanon paid a heavy price, their land once again a battlefield for other nations' rivalries. Thousands of kilometers to the south, another of Iran's key allies joined the war, widening its geographic scope to the critical maritime choke points of the Arabian Peninsula. Yemen's Houthi rebels, who control the capital Sana'a and much of the country's Red Sea coast, declared their unequivocal support for Iran. On March 2nd, the group announced it had fired 2 long-range ballistic missiles at targets in Israel, a symbolic but potent demonstration of their capability and willingness to strike at the heart of Iran's enemy. While the effectiveness of these initial strikes was debated, the message was unmistakable. The axis of resistance was fully mobilized, and the war now had a southern front that threatened global trade and regional security. The primary threat posed by the Houthis was not their missiles aimed at Israel, but their ability to menace shipping in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. This narrow waterway, like the Strait of Hormuz, is a vital artery for global commerce, connecting the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea via the Suez Canal. The Houthis began launching drone attacks and anti-ship missile attacks against commercial vessels they claimed were linked to Israel or its allies. This campaign of maritime harassment effectively expanded the war's economic dimension, forcing international shipping lines to make a difficult choice: risk attack in the Red Sea, or undertake the long, costly journey around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, adding weeks and millions of dollars to each voyage. The United States Navy, already stretched thin with its operations in the Persian Gulf, was forced to respond. The USS Tripoli, an amphibious assault ship carrying thousands of sailors and Marines, was redeployed to the region alongside other naval assets to protect the shipping lanes. U.S. warships began engaging in defensive actions, shooting down Houthi drones and missiles in near-daily encounters. This created a tense and dangerous standoff in the waters off Yemen. It also raised the risk of direct confrontation between U.S. forces and the Houthis, which could draw the United States even deeper into a multi-front conflict and further destabilize the already fragile situation in Yemen, a country ravaged by years of civil war. The Houthi intervention served Iran's strategic interests perfectly. It imposed direct economic costs on the West, disrupted global supply chains, and demonstrated the reach of Iran's network of allies. By activating the Houthi front, Tehran proved it could exert pressure on multiple strategic choke points simultaneously, complicating the U.S. military's calculations and creating leverage that it hoped could be used in any future negotiations. The attacks in the Red Sea showed the world that the 2026 Iran war was not just a conflict over nuclear ambitions or regional dominance. It was a war that could touch the global economy and threaten the free flow of commerce upon which the modern world depends. Section 4. Iran's Fortress Hormuz Strategy. Facing a technologically superior enemy, Iran leveraged its most powerful geopolitical weapon, its geographic control over the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway, through which a significant portion of the world's oil supplies must pass, became a central theater of the war. In the opening days of the conflict, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the IRGCN, moved to essentially shutter the strait. They deployed fast attack craft to harass shipping. They laid sophisticated sea mines in the shipping channels. They positioned coastal anti-ship missile batteries. The message was clear: if Iran cannot export its oil, then no one in the Gulf will. This Fortress Hormuz strategy had an immediate and dramatic effect on the global economy. With the strait effectively closed, oil prices soared to record highs, creating panic in energy markets and threatening a global recession. Nations heavily dependent on Gulf oil, Europe and East Asia, faced an immediate crisis. The closure also halted the export of liquefied natural gas from Qatar, a critical supplier for many countries. The economic fallout was precisely what Tehran intended. By holding this vital economic artery hostage, Iran ensured the costs were felt worldwide, creating immense pressure for de-escalation on terms more favorable to Iran. The United States and its naval allies were faced with a formidable challenge. Reopening the strait by force would require a massive, highly risky military operation. The U.S. Navy, led by carrier strike groups, established a blockade outside the strait. This created a tense naval standoff at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, a high-stakes game of chicken. A mine-sweeping campaign under threat would be slow and perilous. Constant attacks from missiles, drones, and swarming boats. Any miscalculation could cause catastrophic escalation, potentially sinking tankers and causing an environmental disaster. Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz became its ultimate bargaining chip. In its diplomatic counterproposal, Tehran demanded recognition of its sovereignty over the strait as a condition for peace. That maximalist demand aimed to formalize de facto control and secure future leverage. While unacceptable internationally, it underscored the centrality of the strait to Iran's defense and economic doctrine. The standoff in Hormuz transformed the conflict into a global economic crisis. proving that even when outmatched in conventional military terms, Iran possessed the power to inflict immense pain on the world economy. Section 5. The Shadow War. Strikes on nuclear and industrial sites. Parallel to the more visible battles in the sky and at sea, a more shadowy and arguably more critical front was opened, the campaign against Iran's nuclear and strategic industrial infrastructure. From the very beginning of Operation Epic Fury, a primary objective for both the United States and Israel was the permanent dismantlement of Iran's suspected nuclear weapons program. This involved a series of deep penetration airstrikes using advanced bunker-busting munitions against heavily fortified and often underground facilities. Natanz, Fordo, Arak. These were high-risk missions, designed to inflict irreversible damage on years of Iranian scientific and engineering work. Israel, in particular, took a leading role in this aspect of the campaign. On March 6th, the Israeli military announced it had launched a significant wave of attacks on Iranian regime targets, a deliberately vague term widely understood to include sensitive nuclear production sites and ballistic missile production sites.
Iran will respond forcefully. Our adversaries are playing with fire and will pay a heavy price. These strikes struck at the heart of the regime's pride and strategic ambitions.
The campaign extended beyond just nuclear sites to include Iran's broader industrial base. Strikes targeted key factories involved in drone and missile manufacturing, major oil refineries, and key elements of its power grid. This strategy of economic and industrial warfare aimed to cripple Iran's ability to sustain a long-term conflict. However, it also carried a high risk of civilian casualties, as many facilities were near populated areas. Each strike on a power plant or refinery had cascading effects, impacting hospitals, water supplies, and the daily lives of millions of ordinary Iranians. This systematic degradation of Iran's strategic assets was a race against time. The US and Israel sought to inflict enough damage to force a capitulation, or failing that, to set back Iran's military and nuclear programs by at least a decade. For Iran, it was a desperate battle to defend its most prized assets and preserve its capacity for retaliation and future deterrence. This shadow war, fought with stealth bombers, precision missiles, and against hardened targets buried deep underground, was in many ways the central front of the conflict. Its outcome would likely determine not only the winner of the war, but also the future balance of power in the Middle East for years to come. Section 1. A region on a knife's edge. The 2026 Iran war, now entering its second month, has plunged the Middle East into its most dangerous crisis in decades, creating a volatile new reality with no clear end in sight. The initial US-Israeli decapitation strategy has failed. Instead of capitulation, the attack galvanized a defiant Iran under a new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, who has vowed to fight on until the nation's conditions are met. The result is a brutal, attritional conflict, fought on multiple fronts, in the skies over Iran's cities, in the waters of the Persian Gulf, and in the mountains of southern Lebanon. The entire region is balanced precariously on a knife's edge. The conflict is a violent, entrenched stalemate. The relentless US and Israeli air campaign has inflicted staggering damage, with casualties rising into the thousands. Strategic nuclear and industrial sites have been systematically targeted and degraded. Yet, Iran has proven resilient and capable of inflicting significant pain in return. By effectively closing the Strait of Hormuz and activating its network of regional allies, Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthi rebels in Yemen, Tehran has expanded the war, imposing heavy economic and military costs. The immediate economic consequences are severe and global. Oil prices are soaring, threatening a worldwide recession. Global trade has been rerouted. Supply chains have been fractured, and the skies over a vast swath of the planet remain empty of commercial air traffic. This economic warfare is Iran's primary leverage on the world, ensuring the world is paying a direct price for the instability. The human cost continues to mount with each passing day. In Iran, a severe humanitarian crisis is unfolding, with millions displaced internally and a healthcare system on the verge of collapse. In Lebanon, Israel, and the Gulf states, civilians live under the constant threat of rocket and missile attacks. An entire generation of young people is being scarred by trauma and the loss of education. The war has become a human catastrophe, a grim testament to the failure of diplomacy, where the suffering of ordinary people becomes a mere footnote in strategic calculations. Section 2. An uncertain future. Looking ahead, the path out of this devastating conflict is shrouded in uncertainty. Several potential scenarios exist, none promising a swift or easy resolution. The first, a return to diplomacy, driven by mounting international pressure and the sheer exhaustion of the belligerents. If economic pain becomes too great, or military losses become unsustainable, both sides might be compelled back to the negotiating table. But there is a vast chasm between U.S. and Iranian demands. Any ceasefire talks would be fraught with difficulty, likely resulting in a fragile, temporary truce rather than a lasting peace, leaving core issues unresolved. A second, more terrifying scenario: uncontrolled escalation. Each retaliatory strike risks a miscalculation that could trigger a wider war. A direct confrontation between the U.S. Navy and the IRGC in the Strait of Hormuz, a major Israeli ground invasion of Lebanon, or a direct Iranian missile strike on a major U.S. base. Any of these could be catalysts for a regional conflagration. It could draw in other powers, Russia and China, transforming a regional war into a global crisis. A third possibility, a long, grinding, limited regional war. High-tempo operations could give way to persistent, lower-level hostility. Continued proxy battles in Lebanon and Yemen, sporadic airstrikes, and an ongoing naval standoff in the Gulf. The region would be trapped on a permanent war footing, in a cycle of violence and retaliation, preventing recovery and ensuring years of economic stagnation and prolonged human suffering. The Middle East would become a festering source of global instability. The 2026 Iran war has already redrawn the map of the Middle East. It shattered the previous security architecture and unleashed hard-to-contain forces. How and when it will end is profoundly unclear. The only certainty, the devastating human cost, growing with every bomb dropped and every rocket fired. The fate of millions hangs in the balance, dependent on decisions made in war rooms and distant capitals. The world watches and waits, hoping for a breakthrough for peace, while bracing for the possibility of a much wider, more catastrophic war.